I like to have my guests introduce themselves, just talk a little bit about your background and expertise.
Okay, so I'm a linguist, originally trained in Romance languages. So I did a lot of work in history of the languages. I've written articles on the history of French and other Romance languages, for example. But then I got interested in acquisition and started working on second language acquisition. And so I've since written, I wrote a book on second language acquisition in 2000, and then again in 2007, I published a book called Language Development and Age, which was about the idea of a critical period for language acquisition in first language and second language. And then I just recently published Bilingualism, Language Development and Processing Across the Lifespan, which deals with several profiles of bilinguals, and also there's a chapter on monolingual development, and it contrasts children's processing of language or comprehension and production with that of adults.
I really enjoyed doing some research for this topic. Yeah, I was quite ignorant of the field in general, but before I started, I just kind of imagined linguistics sort of like being English class, but it's really an interdisciplinary field, right? You got it's philosophy, it's psychology, anthropology, and all these things kind of tied together, and it was really cool. On the surface, you think of language as just kind of this database of words, and you just try and accumulate as many words in your head as you can. But as we'll get into, it's much more complex than that when you think about the grammar and all the complexity of thoughts that you have to kind of put together in some interesting way that's understandable to other people. Yeah. And then what's really incredible is when young kids are able to pick this up and understand these complex languages very quickly. And then I want to contrast that, because I'm trying to learn Spanish right now, and I want to try and understand these two processes. And we see kids pick up these languages so fast that it's like, man, there's something different going on, it seems like, with these kids. Then it seems almost overwhelming as an adult to try and learn a language. There's just so much to learn, I guess. So yeah, I'd like to kind of learn about both processes, compare and contrast them a little bit. So that's sort of my plan for this conversation.
Okay. I don't know if you got that email I sent earlier today, because I know you had to go to work, I think. But one of the persons who's done a tremendous amount of work over the decades really is Patricia Kuhl, who's at the University of Washington. And she's giving a speech on breaking the speech code. And this is what kids are doing the first year. And so it's really that first year that is so crucial to the development of first language, because babies are born with the capacity to learn any language, obviously, because they do it. And but now we've been doing all these experiments. Scientists have been doing experiments with babies, showing how they actually break the code. And Pat Kuhl has done a lot of those kinds of experiments. So, for example, they've done studies with newborns that show that they can tell the difference between so we have a distinction across languages. They have a distinction between consonants like P and B. Now, P, you can see it's made with two lips, right? It's a bilabial. And B is the same. It's exactly the same. It's just that you start vocalizing your language folds. All right. And you can feel it. You say buh, buh, buh. You can feel the sound in your voice, and that's called voicing. And so babies who are just born make a distinction just as adults do. So you can generate these machine generated ba 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 ba, and at some point the adults will say it's a P, and after that it's a B, or vice versa. And babies do exactly the same thing. So it's pretty remarkable that they're born with that ability to make that categorical distinction. Right. So then from there on, so they're already listening, and they are also able to recognize voices. They have done prenatal testing with a mother reading the same story over and over. And then after the baby is born, they do, they'll play a story, the same story that the mother's reading or that somebody else is reading, and they prefer the story they know, A, and B, they prefer their mother that they've been hearing all the time while they were in the womb. So they're already attuned to language.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. Is it mostly accepted in your field now that there's an innateness, some genes that are programming your brain, telling you this is important to key into? People
Right.
people making these sounds mean something, right? And you
Right.
should kind of pay attention. And there's very, very subtle differences, as you were saying,
Right.
just between like P's and B's, and already they can kind of key into those very subtle
Mhm.
differences.
Mhm.
And maybe they don't understand what it is, but they know to at least pay attention.
Yeah.
Right. So
Right.
that's
I mean, we're saying they know it. I mean, it's kind of because their little minds are, sort of blank at that point. They're full of all these neurons that have been, developing during gestation, and then they continue to expand their brains and develop the brains. The first year, they're establishing sensory motor pathways in their brain, and that's what's really important because that allows them to be able to understand, so the audio coming in, and also to figure out the production, so that when they're doing, your little daughter who's doing her babbling, she's producing sounds that are going to be, actually, because they've done these studies too, they are going to be determined by what she's had as input. So she would prefer a Spanish ah or an English ah to a Swedish ah or a Japanese ah, because they all slightly vary. And it's turned out that the babies prefer the sounds that are in their own ambient environment. And so that's how they end up babbling those very sounds.
Yeah, I'd like to get into that a little bit later with all the sounds and accents and things like that. But let's back up just a little bit and talk about language itself, just conceptually what language is. My understanding is the way we think about language is it's pretty unique to humans, right? We know there's other communication and things in animals, but the way we think of language as a way to communicate basically an infinite number of ideas to each other, that's really unique to humans, right?
Right, right. Yeah, I mean, it's not just a communication system, as you said, a mechanism to portray an unlimited number of concepts. I mean, that touches on a whole lot of aspects of language that are so important. But it's not simply communication, as you say later on, because you talk about the language as a tool for thinking. So in a sense, our ability to be human, to be able to send a rocket to the moon, to be able to think about the past and future, all of those things are related to language. The notion of displacement, in time and place. So you can think about being here or being in Colorado, or you can think about the past and future. Those things are all, directly related to language in the sense it permits us to do all these other reflective things. I guess what I would say, it's not simply the concepts. So you talked about words, but then later on you mentioned grammar. Like we know that animals can recognize certain words, dogs and monkeys, and they've trained chimpanzees to do certain symbolic things. And clearly animals are able to do a certain amount of that, but language is just so much more complex. So it's this infinite possibility of language that allows us to come up with brand new ideas. And if you have a sentence that's probably more than 20 words long, it's probably never been uttered before.
Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, the complexity is pretty incredible. And so that's what we think of as grammar then, is like the way that we kind of group ideas together, but also have sort of ways of pointing, saying this belongs to this idea and this belongs to this idea. And I've seen the way linguists basically map out sentences, kind of dissect them scientifically to try and understand them. And then there's this idea that so Chomsky's sort of universal grammar, right? That languages, although they have different structures and My understanding is just that there's some way that humans have of perceiving the world, and we construct that into words. And since humans are more or less the same in terms of their thought processes, the construction of language across languages and cultures is more or less the same.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, I mean, essentially, languages have to be relatively similar in a sense to be learnable by kids. So we have this innate predisposition to learn language, so babies are ready to do it. And then they, I gave you a couple of examples, and they go through the, understanding part, and you talked about understanding versus speaking. And then they start developing the ability to produce toward the end of the first year. So all languages have essentially, they have words, right? And that's called the lexicon or the dictionary or whatever. And they all have a sound system, which relates to phonology. And the number of sounds that are possible in human language are not, infinite. We have a really, limited number of sounds that we can use, vowels and consonants. And, maybe you've got about, 40 to 50 in a given language. And so you can't just make any old sound and make it a language, a sound, like you don't have hiccups or you don't have raspberries, even though they're possible, or coughs. And they've done experiments where they try to substitute things like that, and babies just don't pay any attention to those things. So babies are attuned to what are the sounds that are going to be legal human language sounds. And so besides the language, the sound system, there's also the morphosyntax, which is how you put words together. So word order, and also how you have to put certain endings. Now, English doesn't have a whole lot of endings, but some languages like Spanish have a lot more. So that's basically it, phonology, morphosyntax, the lexicon, and phonology.
Yeah, the endings are different. The example I got, which when I thought about it, it's like, wow, that's interesting. It was just the simple sentence, Bill walks. And that S has so much meaning that you have to kind of dissect in the sentence. That means it's a single person, it's in present tense, it means they're done habitually and not just this one time. And all that meaning is just derived from that one sound in the context of the rest of the words. And so there's an amazing amount of information in language once you kind of step back and analyze it. It's really interesting. Can we talk a little bit about writing as well? Because a lot of people engage with language that way. Now, of course, that's quite new in human evolution, but I assume there's some overlap in terms of what we're doing in our heads with reading, overlaps significantly with what we do speaking. Yeah. Could you talk a little bit about how that works?
And I think this is really interesting because there's a special part of our brain. So, the brain is in here in our heads, and it's got these different parts to it. And the most important part for language is the left hemisphere, particularly the frontal part, and also the temporal part. And then way back here, it's called the occipital lobe. And that's an area that's really involved in vision. And so it's been studied a whole lot in terms of vision by, psychologists and neurologists who study vision. But of course, if you're reading, you're looking at a page. And so you are getting the input back there. And in this area that comes over here, just when it's going over toward the temporal lobe, the parietal lobe, that is an area called the visual word form area. And it is an area that recognizes orthography or writing. So it'll recognize, if you're like Chinese English bilingual, it will tell, this is going to be Chinese characters, or this is, a Roman alphabet. And it doesn't interpret it yet, it just recognizes it. And the equivalent part on the right hemisphere is a part that is involved in face recognition. So this part here in the left hemisphere has just developed relatively recently, as you say, in evolutionary terms. So it goes from there, and then, because you talk also about the subvocalization. So if you're reading, and they've studied this now, they look at these fMRI, magnetic resonance imagery scans of the brain, and they can see that then the way your mind is processing this is it then goes into the vocal area. And even if you're not saying it, your brain is processing it in that area. So it's clearly an important part. And then it goes further front where it's going to be interpreted in terms of first the sounds, because it comes from the back, and then it goes to the sound part, and then it comes to the front where it's looking at the morphosyntax, and looking at the way words are put together, and this S at the end of he reads or he walks. So, it's pretty fascinating how these studies of the brain have shown exactly what people are doing when they're reading. The other interesting thing about that visual word form area is that pre-literate children, when they look at kids who are like 4 years old and don't read yet, it's kind of underdeveloped. But then as people develop their literacy skills, it becomes more and more developed. So that kind of tells you about the brain part of that. I'd say adults are using written language so frequently now. And, we're looking at our cell phones, we're looking at our computers, we're typing, we're, tapping. And so what they found is that we get the same reactions, in terms of our brain and our comprehension and our production, whether we're, doing it orally or doing it in writing. So very similar processes.
That's interesting. I like that idea. Is some insight into how the brain works in general too, because there's we didn't evolve to read, but it sounds like we've kind of hijacked or reused part of our brain, like you said, for identifying faces, and it's now used for identifying words. And we've kind of reappropriated parts of our brain to do this new task that it's not really designed to do, but like how flexible our brain is at adapting to different situations. So that's really interesting to me. Yeah, so we can get back to the first time learning language, where you talked about babies and how important this is to their development. Can you run through a little bit more into the development, talk about like at what stages they learn, more complex grammar, when you can converse with them and like they start really kind of give and take and can participate in a conversation, that sort of, and how that process works, how they kind of, get those ideas.
So babies and, well, maybe adults too, I don't know, and children, obviously, because they learn at different ages. They can learn a language, when they're 3 or 4, pick up, say, a second language at that point. They do both bottom up and top down. And so the bottom up sorts of ways of learning are getting like phonetic detail and getting like, so you get, and like the baby will hear a word and then try to get that exact word and get the sounds right. And when they're doing babbling, they often are doing, they're able to do really very good imitations of the right vowel or the right consonant. So that would be the kind of the detail part. The top down is when they kind of use templates or underspecified templates, or what are called proximate units. That is, they'll take a sort of a big, like a chunk of something, and try to, just use a big thing, an underspecified thing, as opposed to getting a detailed thing. So they kind of have these two strategies that they're using. And, then they use both of them to be able to learn. So they learn, first of all, they get those sounds. And then by the end of the first year, they're usually, beginning with words, but they call them proto words, because they're not really, it may be some kind of like utterance that they may use over and over again. And it's not really a word, but they use it and it's used as a sort of word, And the idea there is that they're kind of like substituting this little template of a proto word for a real word. And then once they get a little better, then they'll be able to specify it and make it sound like the right word. So they get those words, and then that's called the holophrastic stage, where they just say one word, and they'll get a certain number of words, So in the second year, they're just starting, with these words. And then as you go through the second year, they start putting them together, and they'll do a 2-word. And that's called the telegraphic stage, where they are just putting, like 2 words together, like mommy, sock, like, and they're probably saying that is mommy sock. But, they'll just be like a couple of words. They're not really using grammar yet. And then as you get into the third year, they're starting to put things together and putting together using actual verbs, like saying mommy walks. But they go through a period when it's called the optional infinitive period, when they'll sometimes use mommy walks, and other times they'll just say her walk, where they'll use objective pronouns. They don't use nominative. They don't say she, they say her. And then they don't put anything on the verb. And this is true across languages. So like in Spanish languages, well, Spanish is different because it's, you don't need to use a subject in Spanish. You can say hablo, you don't need to say the yo because you have the ending on the verb. So in Spanish, kids learn the endings on verbs really soon, as opposed to English, where the kids they have this optional infinitive stage where sometimes they use the right inflection and sometimes they don't. Sometimes they put the S on it, sometimes they don't. But languages like French, which do require a subject, they also have this optional infinitive stage too. So the languages that have subjects kind of go through this period when they're variable. But the Spanish speakers and Italian speakers are very quick at getting those endings, which is pretty remarkable.
And so there's more or less rules that each language follows. Of course, there's exceptions in the grammar. And the first time the kids are learning this, it's not explicit at all, these rules. They're always inferring, but they are able to generalize and sort of create those rules in their mind and apply them to new situations, express new ideas based on the rules that they learned implicitly, right? Yeah, okay, good. That's what I wanted to use then to transition to when we learn as adults. At least my experience, we learn all of those rules explicitly. My wife's opinion is that it's actually easier. She thought she learned languages faster by learning all these explicit rules. And then sure, you have to think about them for a while and until they become intuitive.
Yeah, so I guess we could talk about implicit and explicit learning. And some people, for example, Ullman has talked a lot about procedural and declarative knowledge and learning. So declarative knowledge is knowing, like facts sort of thing. So that's kind of like this explicit sort of where you have to learn the rules and so on. And procedural is knowing how to do something. So like if you think about driving a car, how do you learn to drive a car? Well, you learn to drive a car by driving a car, but you also have to learn, you first have to learn certain things about the car, so that would be declarative, where you are memorizing the traffic rules and learning how to turn on the motor and, so on and so forth. But you can only really do it by driving the car. And it's the same thing with language. So you can learn those rules. And traditionally, there's been all this, in classrooms, we teach grammar rules, but it's also possible to do, I think, more inductive learning. I think, so I've done some experiments with colleagues on different methods of teaching, for example, whereby you don't just say, here's the rule for making some kind of gender agreement in Spanish, say to agree masculine with masculine and feminine with feminine nouns and adjectives, that you rather give a whole bunch of examples to the students and have them infer the rule. So that would be, even in a classroom, you can do that kind of thing. I think what happens is you really have to have a certain amount of input in a second language as well as in a first language to be able to gain a certain level of proficiency. And so they kind of set that rule at something like 10,000 words. By the time you're at 10,000 words, you could probably, you've probably had enough input to to get you to a level of being able to carry on a conversation. And also, so there are different types of learners. So you may be a rule-based learner, or you may be somebody who only wants to have input and like doesn't want to hear anything about rules.
I see.
Yeah.
And then a lot of, let's say, language learning when you're not a kid is done through reading. It's like, even if it's in a classroom setting, you're given homework. And we talked about how it's, very similar parts of your brain are being activated and it's tied together. But I was just wondering if there's something important about learning it through speaking and having those sounds, and that the process of hearing it in terms of understanding the language, as opposed to reading it, which of course is a valuable tool, but just in terms of the differences and the speed and those things in which we learn.
I think it's really important to hear language. I can barely say a few words in German, but I was in Germany a few years ago, and it just helped to hear the language around, and then it sort of seemed I could maybe come out with a few more words than I usually could. The environment is really, really important. And in a classroom, you just don't have an opportunity. If you've got 20 or 30 students, you divide up, 50 minutes for how many students? There are 25 students. That would be if each student could actually have 2 minutes, but that's not the case because there's a whole lot of other stuff going on. There may be I was talking to somebody recently about those, there's a whole lot of software out there for language learning. And they give you a lot of feedback, and you have both audio and visual things. So, that's another, it's just a new development in language learning for adults, I think. And that might be, I don't know if you've tried any of that, but, that could be a really useful tool also. And also having correspondence with real people, because there are also setups whereby you can be involved with having online conversations with speakers of other languages, and maybe have an exchange where, like you would speak Spanish and they would speak English to you, or something like that. So, there are a lot more opportunities, I think, now opened up with the internet.
Yeah, I'm sure there's better and worse apps. I played with a few. Most of them I didn't especially like, mostly because a lot of it was translating, and that really to me seemed like not the way to learn another language. Was to take the primary language and then just apply it. And it seems like when you're learning a language, you want to be learning it sort of new and not just translating in your head all the time, right?
Right.
Okay.
That would be my take.
Yeah. Okay. I didn't know if there's a lot of research supporting that.
Well, you're not gonna learn how to speak or to understand unless you hear the language and attempt to use it. Because you have to develop the motor skills, and that's what the little babies are doing so quickly. And then we have our first language, kind of filling our brain and totally controlling our muscle use, and there's all this specialized muscles in our mouth and throat, and so we're able to, and our ears too, that we've gotten used to our first language, and so you've got to overcome that to get the second language, and you really have to practice to get those sounds right.
Right. You said earlier that there's different sounds for a Japanese A and a French A. And yeah, so I was wondering, like, almost basically everyone who is raised in another, like immigrants raised in another country, and then even if they learn the language, there's always an accent, right? And is that just because we have approximations for these sounds already? So do we skip over that really early baby stage where we're practicing all those sounds and trying to get the feedback and trying to get it just right? Or like, we got an A, we can use it.
So there's a second language scholar who's done a lot of work on sounds. Flaggy is his name, and his idea is that if you have a sound that's really different, then it's easier for the second language learner to learn that sound because they don't have something interfering. Whereas if it's almost the same, then they're not going to get that phonetic detail because they just substitute their own vowel, let's say, or consonant. So yeah, that's exactly what you just said. And so it has been posited, and he's shown it for certain sounds.
So is there like a fundamental difference in our brains when we learn a language as a kid versus as an adult? Because when we learn as a kid, it seems like there's something on the brain going on where it's like we're in language learning mode right now. And that was in Steven Pinker's book, where he thought basically there's a window for learning languages and where you're really keyed in, and then after that maybe it's just like learning another skill, and it's in a different part of the brain tied to just learning anything else that you'd want to be learning, almost maybe almost like a menopause for sexual maturity. It's like this is your window, and then afterwards like we're not doing that anymore.
Yeah.
Is there a lot of support for that? I'm sure it's controversial.
Well, I think we just understand more and more about how it works. And this, well, actually, I mentioned Ullman and the procedural declarative stuff. So Ullman was actually Steven Pinker's student. And so he's kind of carried that to this other notion of, he says, babies are learning language as a procedural thing. And later on, they switch, once they've kind of gone through this as children and then they become teenagers, they start doing more declarative learning, where they're learning more like facts and things and rules, like you said. So that's true, because the really young babies and toddlers are learning these things and they don't know what they're doing exactly. It's just coming in and it's developing in their brains. And as I said before, that sensory motor development in the early years is really, really important, because even if they are, say, 3 to 6 years old, they're still really flexible and able to learn, this sensory motor stuff. Whereas when you try to learn sounds as an adult, there's always the accent, foreign accent, and there's also really slow processing, so that you can end up being able to understand Spanish. You'll just keep going at it, and then you'll become a fluent understander. But your speech will probably be much slower, because as a second language adult learner, you just can't do that rapid and really careful hearing and production that young children and babies gain as they are learning in this procedural way. But it's not like it's black and white, that it's procedural and then declarative. So it's not like there's a total divide, because we obviously do procedural learning as adults, like learning to drive a car, like I said. And as the child gets older, there's a whole lot of stuff coming back to the writing and literacy issue. So children learn really basic stuff when they're babies and infants, babies and toddlers, I mean. But then as they go to school, there's still a lot of finer points of language that they haven't quite gotten yet, like using some, past pluperfect tense, or using some conditional thing that is very complex, or making really long sentences with complex clauses. A 4-year-old isn't going to do that. And all of that kind of more complex syntax is developed in a way more with literacy skills. There's this kind of transition where you've got both things going on. And so kids are learning, older kids, kids in elementary school, but they're in school, are learning things in this much more declarative way.
I was wondering though, if learning the language in those different ways is fundamentally different than learning other things, because I feel like kids learn many things early in that sort of what were you saying, declarative and procedural. Yeah. So is there something special about language, or is it just generally how kids learn things in general that's different from learning as an adult? Because when we're taught things as an adult, very often it's spelled out to us.
So there's this term, experience expectant. Experience expectant learning means that the the baby is primed, as we talked about earlier, to get the experience. Oh, I'm looking for, sounds. I'm looking for language sounds, not just burps or coughs or something else. So they are experience expectant. They're looking for certain things. And it's been shown that they they expect certain things at certain ages. So at first they're looking for the sounds, and once they get these sounds down, then they're looking for statistical patterns in the way speech is produced to see. So there's how can they tell what words are? Because words are all just strung together in speech, but they have to be able to speech parse. They have to be able to divide it up into words. And so they figure out that's what they're looking at next. So then by the time they get to school, they're probably expecting then they're expecting literacy skills. And by then they're moving into not just this procedural kind of stuff, but more declarative. And I think that then as adults, we have a lot of those skills, but we've also been really set in our ways so that, we're not able to learn new things quite as easily.
All things, basically, not just language things.
Well, I guess. I think language is special.
Okay.
It's clearly very special, because I think it's what makes us unique. It makes us humans, our Homo sapiens unique.
So if I stick a 5-year-old in an introductory college class for a language, are they going to be top of the class, or how are they going to perform? Or is that just like a different style of learning that they're not good at?
Oh, well, I think they definitely wouldn't, because it would depend on what the class was like. The conference I was at in Paris was on research I've been doing in the Seattle Public Schools, where there are dual language immersion programs. And my colleague Anna and I have been collecting data from 10-year-olds. They have a 50% Spanish, 50% English classroom all day long. So it's like morning is Spanish, afternoon is English. So there are some children in the class that are native speakers of Spanish who, were born with a family that speaks Spanish. But other ones they started out kindergarten in English, and they're exposed only with content-based stuff. This has become a very popular way of teaching young children another language, that you just have them exposed in a classroom where you teach social studies, or you teach language studies, or, they don't teach per se, here's grammar. They just speak Spanish in the classroom and talk about the social topics that they're going to talk about, or history, or math, or whatever the topic is.
So kids really thrive in that sort of environment.
Yeah.
But if you were to stick an adult in high school, start with them learning classes in different languages, it would be a lot harder, probably, right?
Yeah, probably. I don't, I've been involved in language programs, and I've always, I've been an advocate for teaching in the language and teaching inductively. So giving examples rather than, teaching rules and teaching it in English, but rather just speaking, forcing the students to speak French, let's say, from day one. And where you just use a lot of the language and you try to give a lot of examples. So you can do that kind of thing in a classroom, but it's still limited because you only have 50 minutes.
Mm-hmm. So in either case, that you're just saying exposure is always good. Just more information, more practice, just like any skill that you're reinforcing. Good. So let's talk globally about bilingualism. I looked up and it said over half the world is bilingual, because we have all these mixing of cultures, where we have, colonialization, of course, was a big part of that, people coming in and imposing their language. But a lot of parts of the world are bilingual, especially immigrants and things like that. Yeah. So I want to talk about maybe some misconceptions about things like that. So like I've heard, or people maybe just have the stereotype that learning 2 languages can delay the development of learning the first one. And I think that's more or less disproven now. But could you say something about that? Because we said it's this really hard cognitive task that you're doing. And if you're doing it twice as a kid, you would you would think there'd be some problems there, some delay.
So in the book I just mentioned that I just published, I have a chapter on simultaneous bilinguals who grow up with two languages from birth, and then another chapter on sequential child bilinguals who learn a second language between 3 and 6. And all the studies of these children show that, well, usually there's never in a total balance of two languages, so that bilinguals use their two languages in different contexts, and so they're not, they're going to have different vocabularies probably because they'll use them in different contexts, so that, like if you're using Spanish in a home context, you're going to be having different kinds of words and different functions than you would and then the English may be a more professional thing, or vice versa. Yeah, so there would be differences between the two languages. When you compare children learning two languages to monolinguals, usually they have a slightly lower vocabulary count. If you take a 4-year-old who's a crib bilingual, who was born, with the two languages, and compare a monolingual English child, the monolingual child will have probably a greater number of vocabulary items. I mean, there are slight differences like that, but if you look at the total number of concepts or the total number of vocabulary, then the bilingual would probably have more items because they would have the items in both languages. But the other thing is that they reach those milestones at approximately the same age. It's been so well documented now for both the simultaneous ones and like early sequential learners. I mean, they obviously have to go through a period when they're learning because they're not like crib bilinguals. But once they get to a certain level, they are equivalent essentially. So I don't see a disadvantage as long as they have enough input. If they don't get enough input, then it doesn't really stick, and it would be definitely asymmetric mastery of the two languages, which, I don't know that that's such a bad thing either, but isn't it better to know some of a second language than nothing at all?
Yeah, the point about sticking is fun. I met somebody who spent some time in Germany when they were young, and they wrote stuff, and then as a teenager they had forgotten. They couldn't even read the things that they had wrote, when they were a kid before. I thought that was really interesting.
Yeah, that's that whole attrition, losing the language, right?
And there's I was reading before this, there's like those like folk legends almost of people who go into comas and forget their first language, and then they remember some language that they picked up as a kid, and then that's the only language that they're able to use to speak. It made me wonder if like different languages then are compartmentalized in different places in your brain. Is that
no, in fact, that what the research seems to show is that our languages just riff off of one another. To retrieve a word, for example, there's been a whole lot of study on lexical access, finding a word. And they do that with bilinguals all the time to see like how quickly they can get the word in the two languages. It's become really clear that anytime you see, like if you see curtain or like a blue square, I see a blue square behind you, a square, you're thinking of the word and it'll come in both languages. So you're accessing one language, but you can't suppress the other one. And it's also true, and they've done fewer studies, but it's also true in terms of like constructions, like a syntactic construction, like using a prepositional phrase versus like I gave him the book versus I gave the book to him. That they've shown that if you prime someone who's bilingual, like in Dutch and English, which has both of those structures, that you give them, they're more apt to produce in the other language the prepositional one, like I gave the book to him, if they've just heard it in one language.
Yeah, that makes sense to me. I would think anyone who's reasonably versed in different languages probably could intuit that that these are kind of simultaneous parallel processes and not separate beings in your brain. That's good for that. I want to talk a little bit philosophical, just some interesting things that I thought about language and questions that I had. It's less on the bilingualism and more just about language and thinking in general. So I've heard this idea that like that writing or speaking is thinking, right? And we often need to talk through ideas or write them down to like get an idea straight in our head. So I find that very interesting, that it's not just a way of mapping and communicating the world to other people, but it's a process for helping us think about the world. And it's this.
No, I agree that it's, yeah, just what you said. We kind of talked about that a little earlier. You can think abstractly in terms of, say, just numbers, or I guess music. Like you can think of really, those are very human notions. I guess it's harder for me to think about just numbers, but I guess you could think of certain kinds of abstract ideas that aren't related to language. But I think that a lot of what we do is related to language. If you just think about entertainment, that's essentially language. Well, I guess you could say games, like, sports games and things like that are not, they're going to be visual kind of things, but you're probably going to talk about the plays. And in fact, sportscasting, when you think about it, is all about language, and it's about translating what you're seeing on the field. There's a lot of language in everything we do, I guess.
I came across this idea before. It wasn't about language. They were talking about how humans use tools, and there are external tools that we use, and that would be like the writing and things. But then there's also tools that we've developed that we've basically put in our brain, like maps. And it's not something we think of naturally, but it's a way of conceptualizing the world in our head that makes it easier to navigate, and just a positive tool that we can use, that it exists in the world, but also we've put it into our head. And I've heard like people who know how to use abacuses can do mental math easier because they can picture the abacus in their brain and do things like that. And I was just wondering if you could think of language as something like that, as this tool that we develop to communicate ideas with each other, but it's also just a really good way of making mental models and kind of parsing through ideas by working through the grammar that we've developed and all these things like that we naturally kind of put ideas together. And through the process of using language to create those ideas, we've been able to think more precisely or more thoroughly about these ideas.
Well, when you talked about the maps, it made me think of the hippocampus. It's part of the limbic system, which is very inside of the brain. And it is what controls our memory. And it's also related to space, so maps. And they did a study 15 years ago, I guess, of cab drivers in London who, they have to memorize the entire map of London. And it turned out that their hippocampus was larger than the average hippocampus. And they were attributing it to their map reading abilities and their maps in their brains abilities. And so I think that that notion of language is also really tied to our memory, which is also going to be, a crucial factor for us to be able to use language. Because if we can't connect to the past and the future, our language would become useless. So this is kind of getting off on your topic, but
No. That's
it's kind of
very
interesting. I thought that
Yeah. No, I think that's important.
that link of
To think
memory and
about sort of
mapping.
the way we perceive the world is very much tied to we have memory, and we're constantly projecting into the future. And that's again a very human thing. I mean, animals do have some sort of instincts that help them do that, but I think it's a very human thing to tie time together like that, so kind of thoroughly in our head and keep it in there. And I could definitely see language being an important component in that process of keeping it in our head. And then also there, I know that ideas then that we convert into words basically, and then when we're trying to remember ideas, oftentimes we'll remember the words instead of the idea, and then kind of translate it back. And so like the ideas that are stored in our brain are often the words and not necessarily the raw concepts or whatever. I got that from reading a Malcolm Gladwell book where he was talking about counting in numbers, where so basically the number system in a lot of Asian languages is simpler, and kids learn to count earlier. And so that's just a basic part of learning, and we can talk about that too a little bit. But he said also then if you give most Asians just a random set of numbers, they're better at remembering a longer string of numbers than most other people, because you're remembering the word, you're not remembering the number. And if the words are simpler.
Right, that the digit span that's one of those tests they do for short-term memory. So that, there are all these little tests that psychologists use, and that's one of them. So they'll give you, so many digits, and you have to remember them, or then you have to say them backwards. Those are called digit span tests. So yeah, I guess they may be easier for Asian languages, you're saying.
Okay, and then so maybe, and then do you know if there's languages that are just generally easier or harder to learn? Like I have seen like they kind of rate languages. This one takes this many hours, this one takes this many hours. I'm sure part of that is based on your experience as well. I assume languages are more complex, and then does that lead to like maybe stunted thinking or more complex thinking? I could see it going either way.
Well, in principle, all languages should be, able to express the same ideas.
Sure.
But on the other hand, some languages are, what we have, how many new words do we get every year in English, for example? English is just a really expanding language. So I don't think you can say, in terms of words alone there. Then in terms of other systems, you can talk about, well, I guess you could talk about complexity. It's a really very difficult topic though, because, there's not a lot of agreement. It's clear that if you're talking about learning a second language as an adult, well, or maybe as a kid too, and you have one language, if you're studying a language that is really, really different, it's going to be a lot more difficult than if you had a language that's related. So if you learn Spanish and you learn French or Italian, let's say, maybe Italian's a little easier than French, I'm not sure. Well, it's a little more explicit. And, so then it would be easier than if you were learning Mandarin, because Mandarin is going to be really different from Spanish. So that's one difference. And then I guess you can talk about how complex is the sound system. So Mandarin has all these tones, which we don't have in English or in Spanish. And so that's a whole different sort of phenomenon that you would have to learn. There's more limited morphology in Mandarin, I understand. I know a little bit about Mandarin, but I think that it might be more complex because you don't have a whole lot of cognates. Whereas if you're learning a European language, you're going to probably have a lot of cognates with English.
What are cognates?
Oh, cognates are words that are similar in the two languages. So if you say, well, book, and I know that's Buch in German, B-U-C-H, so that would be a cognate.
And then most languages, I would think, have similar things that we do with the language. We like to rhyme and create poems, and I'm sure they do the same. Even though they're different words with different meanings, they still key into the phonetic part of it and like to rhyme them, probably create puns and all those sort of things as well, right? That's kind of universal. That's all my questions here. Do you want to talk about maybe more explicitly about your work, or where you think the future of the field is going, where you think sort of the interesting research is being done in linguistics now?
Oh, well, so I guess, there's sort of been an explosion in the sense of the big data, if you want. So 20 years ago, people were just doing like maybe case studies or something of individuals. And now, because there's so much, well, you can do big surveys with using internet tools like, I don't know if you know about Mechanical Turk. It's a procedure whereby you can reward individuals with like a penny or something if they participate in a survey. But because you can get thousands, you can amass a lot of data. And so that's sort of been the direction, I think, that bilingualism and linguistic studies have been going in. And I guess the other thing would be a collection of data in experimental situations. So in the linguistics department of the University of Washington, we have several labs. Like we have a sociolinguistics lab, we have a computational linguistics lab, we have a neurolinguistics lab, we have a language and development processing lab where they do, babies. And there's a phonetic lab where, they take acoustic measures. And a lot of those labs have been formed in the last 10 years. So there's just a lot of experimental data being collected. And that means that whenever you're coming to some conclusions, it's not just hypothetical. You've actually got data to show that. But, sometimes you get contradictory data too. And that's good because then, you want to be able to replicate things. And so it's a much more data oriented and big data oriented approach, I think, than we had 20 years ago.
Yeah, because it's such an interdisciplinary subject, you're able to take the new tools from biology, the new tools from data, all these different ways, and kind of find ways to use them and piece them together. Great. Yeah. Thanks a lot.
Okay. Well, I really enjoyed talking to you, and thanks so much for interviewing me.